It is now my honor to introduce Dr. Christina Vella, who will talk about the pirates Laffite and their most famous exploit. And I do want to say that one of the great things about the symposium is to get the very deep history that a lot of other people don't know, even historians. And so I want to point out that I think Dr. Vella is going to point this out too, that in a previous symposium, I discovered, and I think we discovered, that unlike 99% of the historians and other sources out there who misspell the name Laffite, we discovered at one of the symposiums the correct way to do it. So anyway, so I thought that was a good introduction to the topic. Dr. Christina Vella, a very eminent historian in Louisiana. She's the recent recipient of the Louisiana Book Fair Writer of the Year Award, written countless national level biographies and other works, and has been a great friend to St. Bernard Parish for decades, as well as the Nunez History Lecture Series and the Symposium. We rely on her heavily for the organization and is kind of a beacon of history. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Christina Vella.
Well, naturally, we always have to start off by thanking everybody. Curtis Manning has put together this thing. It's just incredible, the work that he's done. We were afraid 3 people would show up in this weather, and instead, look at you. I want to thank you so much for coming out in this weather and being so dedicated, and especially to thank Curtis for all his work. So, I'm talking about the Laffites. You've all heard about the Laffites in the Battle of New Orleans. Laffite, as Curtis says, is spelled the Laffites that we know, and it's kind of a strange spelling even in France where they originated. It's L-A-F-F-I-T-E. We're accustomed to spelling it with 1 F and 2 T's, but that's incorrect. What I'm going to talk to you about are things that happened before what Ron was talking about, before the Battle of New Orleans. It's basically the lead up to it and the participation of the Laffites in it. You've heard how Jean Lafitte, the Battle of New Orleans, you know, they were so instrumental in it. So this is a sort of examination of their whole career. The Lafitte brothers were born near Bordeaux in a little town. Pierre was born, Pierre Lafitte, in 1770, Jean Lafitte in 1782. So Jean is actually 12 years younger than his brother Pierre. Pierre's mother died in childbirth, and his father remarried and had about 5 more children. So they're actually only half-brothers. The father was a middle-class merchant. He had a store, probably. The children were pretty well educated. Now, you have to remember that we're talking about a time when average people, the bourgeois class, was not well educated. They could read, they could write, they could spell pretty well, but they weren't people of great elegance in speech or anything like that. They were terrible spellers, terrible handwriting, but they got along fine as far as education. We don't know squat about their childhood, really. We don't know whether they had an education, whether they got along in the family, what decided Pierre Lafitte finally to decide in 1802 to emigrate. We can say, well, the French Revolution took place in 1789 and was still going on in 1792, and maybe there were economic reasons, but this is all speculation. We don't know why he decided to come to the New World, but he did, and he decided to go around 1802, Pierre alone, because Jean at this time is still too young, to go to Saint-Domingue, which was a French colony. Now, you will encounter several spellings of Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue is the French spelling when it was a French colony. Santo Domingo was the way the Spanish referred to it. And as you know, Louisiana was a Spanish colony for most of its life. And so in all the records, and in my book, I refer to it as Santo Domingo because that's exactly the way the Spanish referred to it. That's Spanish idiom. He gets to Saint-Domingue in the midst of that awful revolution that you've all heard about, the Haitian Revolution, where it deteriorates. It starts as a revolution of the whites and mulattoes in Saint-Domingue against French ownership of the colony. And it deteriorates into a war of all against all. And by 1802, the blacks, free blacks, mulattoes, slaves, are in control of the colony, and they're murdering all the white people they can. And all the white people who can get out are going or leaving. Many of them come naturally to Louisiana, where they speak French, where people speak French. They bring many mulattoes with them, and the mulattoes and the whites bring slaves. So it increases the colony, the Saint-Domingue colony in New Orleans, not just by a lot of very productive white people, but also by many, many skilled slaves and unskilled slaves. And among these people are Pierre Laffite. He goes to Saint-Domingue and he says, I've got to get out of here. And so he leaves. And there is a colony then in New Orleans that consists of people who hang around, the Café du Réfugié, the colony of refugees, and the Colony des Émigrés, the colony of immigrants, and the cafe, various cafes that belong to, Cochot, I think, was one of them, that belonged to these expatriates from Saint-Domingue. When Pierre gets to New Orleans, he buys a ship, which is unusual for a merchant, and he sets up a store. He becomes a merchant. I can't stand standing behind this thing. I gotta move. Let's see. Is this legitimate? Can I do this? I'm gonna drop this on my foot. Just watch. Okay. He sets up a store, and he kind of lets us know by buying this ship that he's got something in mind other than just being a storekeeper. Now, there's this tremendous legend, that the Laffite blacksmith shop, that they were ironmongers and that they engaged in various trades. That's all poppycock. Whatever they did, they weren't blacksmiths. He was a merchant. And he began in New Orleans, and what does he do with the ship? Well, first of all, New Orleans is a boom town now. It's past 1803. It's an American part. They bought the Louisiana Purchase, the whole Louisiana territory. Everybody is starved for goods. People are pouring into New Orleans, and they need more goods than are actually sold here. Well, Pierre acquires a mulatto mistress named Marie Villard, and she becomes his companion for the next 16 years. And by this time, his brother Jean has joined him. And Jean acquires a mistress who is Marie's sister, Catherine. Oh, thank you, honey. I know I'm hoarse. I've never been able to figure this out. For about 2 years, I've had this hoarse voice. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong, except that it makes my lectures kind of sticky. Thank you, honey. So these two, the sisters, this is a kind of a neat arrangement, because the sisters, of course, can get along, more or less. They live in this house together. Jean and Pierre, when they're in New Orleans, live in the house together, and they all start having children. At one point, there are as many as 9 children in the house, not counting the kids who live and die in the house. And so they stay there for a number of years. They have this family, which is essentially a mixed-race family. The sisters were mulattoes, that is, they were children of a white father and a black mother, or a grandfather and a black mother. If you had 1/16 black blood, you were considered biracial. You were considered a mulatto, a quadroon, an octoroon. You were not considered white, in other words. So they get settled in New Orleans, and Pierre starts his business. Now, the way you made money in New Orleans was, ha 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 ha, I knew I'd beat it. What am I doing wrong? It's okay? Oh, it's okay. It's down below me. Oh, yeah, it's on the floor. I probably won't need it except that I'll spit in it without it. It'll go puh, puh, you know, all that stuff. Okay. The way you make money in New Orleans is by smuggling. Why? Okay. There is something called the mercantile theory, which is very important. It's amazing how governments get these ideas in their heads. The mercantile theory is something that dominates international economy for 2 centuries. And what essentially the mercantile theory is that if you're a mother country, and you acquire colonies, this is going to just make your economy take off. And for a while, actually, it does. Because what you do is the mother country buys from the colonial possession. Let's say you're England, you're the mother country, and you colonize America. You have American colonies. Because believe me, this smuggling was not invented by the Spanish. It took place any place where there were colonists and a mother country. There was smuggling going on, and fortunes were made in this smuggling because they couldn't control it. You get things like lumber and cotton and tobacco and corn and sugar from this wilderness colony. It starts off as a wilderness colony. You bring it back to the mother country where your population manufactures clothing and bourbon and all kinds of liquor and whatever else, these raw material, tobacco, you produce cigars and cigarettes and things like that. Okay, so now they're manufactured products, and you bring them back to the colonies, which have nothing. The colonies are totally dependent on imports from the mother country. And you sell it back to the colonies with a tariff, because they're now imported and improved goods. And they're making money hands over fist. The only problem is that in order for the mercantile system to work, you have to impose certain rules. One, the colonies can't produce these things for themselves. That's against the rules. Second, they can't trade with other people. They have to sell their products only to you, their mother country, and they have to buy their products only from you, their mother country. Otherwise, if you let other people start trading with them, then where is your profit? Now, how do you enforce that across an ocean? Well, you don't, because you've got ships coming in and out from all countries, and they work out all kinds of subterfuge to buy things they need from these ships and to sell things they need to these ships to take them to other countries. This is called smuggling. And moreover, when they buy these products, they can evade the tariff. This is what the Boston Tea Party was all about, that the colonists didn't want to pay the tariff on tea, and so they dumped it in the harbor. And this sort of thing was going on all through the colonial world. Well, if you look at a map of what we now call the United States, throughout most of the 18th century and some of the 19th century, the early part of the 19th century, what you see is, you kind of saw it on Ron's map, there's a little knot of the English colonies up there in the northeast. Elsewhere, there's the Louisiana section, which belongs to Spain through most of the 18th century. There's Spanish Florida, and there's the Spanish Southwest. They're surrounded by Spain. So Spain is the country where, when these vessels come in and they're loaded with goods, and this is the country where the smuggling takes place the most. But it isn't the only one. All of the great fortunes in New York, you know, these, we see on television this philanthropy and that philanthropy has been done by, you know, these great old names in banking, very respected names. Well, all those people, hell, they made their fortunes in smuggling, and then they went into banking, and then they went into other things. So smuggling is very, very important. And this is basically what the Laffites get into. They get into the smuggling operation. Piracy is not a matter in these times. Oh, Schutzenheimer. That's okay. Piracy is not a matter of going out and beating somebody up and slashing noses off and things like that and boarding ships. It's a matter basically of just buying and selling illegally. And there's really very little violence involved. They set up, the Laffites do, on Grand Isle. And Grand Isle is a perfect place for smuggling because you can't get in or out of it unless to moor a ship, unless you know those bayous, unless you know those inlets. So merchants who wanted to, ships who wanted to trade on Grand Isle with the Laffites would send a signal, and they'd take a look and they'd see if they wanted the ship to come in, and then they'd send a boat out to guide them into one of the 2 or 3 inlets that would let them get into Grand Isle. And if they didn't want them to, the ship would, chances are, would run aground because there were only a few ways and you had to know how to get into it. It's sort of protected from attack. So they bring them into Grand Isle where there's no legal tax imposed, and since there's no legal tariff tax, they can sell goods a lot more cheaply to the Laffites, to the Sparitarian setup that they have. So they deal in things like tallow for candles, and cloth, and sugar, and tea, and liquor, lots of wine, dishware, glassware, little small furniture. But most of all, what do you suppose their most profitable commodity is? Absolutely, it's slaves. First of all, because the importation of slaves had been illegal everywhere, almost, especially in U.S. territory, by 1803. There's only one place where slavery is still illegal, and that's in the Spanish possessions. But, as I told you, the Spanish possessions are everywhere. The Spanish are in Pensacola. What ships would do is they'd go to Pensacola, they'd pick up slaves that were fresh from Africa, even though we weren't supposed to be importing any more slaves. Now, it was legal to trade on slaves you already had. In other words, slaves who were born here, local slaves, yeah, you could buy and sell those. You just couldn't enlarge the institution by bringing in more slaves from Africa. Well, of course, as we see, the Spanish get the slaves from Africa. They're in Spanish Pensacola. Pierre even goes to Pensacola and lives there for a while in order to manage the slave operation. So the captain, who's going to come into Barataria, he picks up a load of slaves, maybe even 400 or 500 of them at a time. When he gets near Barataria, he claims distress, and this is an old ploy of smugglers. The ship has run into problems. We need to land in order to save the ship, to make repairs. We need permission to land. So they land at Barataria. They unload the slaves very quickly. They pick up new supplies. They pick up a new crew, and they go out again. If Governor Claiborne, who's responsible for apprehending these smuggling operations, he and the U.S. attorney, the city attorney in New Orleans, if they figure, okay, this is a smuggling ship and it's a big smuggling operation, we're going to go out and stop that ship. By the time he gets there and he gets all the paperwork authorizing him to do it, the ship is gone. So, by the way, what happened to the slaves? Well, the slaves are put up on Barataria, they're kept there, and then a few at a time, they're brought into New Orleans by means of dropping them off at various places along the Mississippi, where then they may be taken by mules or taken a few at a time into New Orleans to be sold. A lot of times, they would announce that they had a big shipment of something, dishes or slaves, and merchants like slave auction dealers or people who had a big emporium of glassware or, objects that could sell, sellers in New Orleans, would come directly to Barataria themselves and buy these things. So they didn't even have to try to smuggle them. It was the problem of the merchant who would buy them. At times, there were as many as 500 people in Barataria who were there just shopping, just people who came to buy the slaves and take them away again. There were 4 water routes into New Orleans that brought the goods into various points on the Mississippi. They were well below New Orleans, but well above the customs inspector at Belize. So from there, the smugglers could take the goods in New Orleans pretty easily. Or, one thing they could do, let me see if you all can hear me can you all hear me if I talk like this? Okay, I have to stand behind here. I don't know why it's so hard for me to stand in one place. One thing they could do is the Laffites, the ship would come in, and the Laffites would seize the slaves. They'd seize everything that was on the ship, as a matter of fact. Or they would go out into the Gulf, and they'd get a ship, they'd attack the ship, they'd seize the slaves and bring them back. They would then turn the slaves over to the authorities in New Orleans, the proper authorities, and they'd collect the award for turning in illegal slaves. Well, now the authorities have all these slaves. What do you think they're going to do with them? They have to auction them off. They can't send them back to Africa. They can't feed them indefinitely. They have to sell them. The Laffites would then buy them back at auction, legally, so with the money that they had collected as their reward. And then they'd resell them. So they wound up, with making a double profit. They did that with a lot of it. One thing the Laffites would not do was harbor runaway slaves. Well, Jean and Pierre become privateers. Pierre stays on the land. Jean, who apparently had some seafaring experience, went out in the ships and the ports. And I need to explain again, many of you probably know this, the difference between pirates and privateers. As a practical matter, one of the big differences is the penalties if you got caught. If you got caught being a pirate, you were hanged. There were room for negotiation if you were a privateer. Piracy was the unlawful taking of one private vessel of another. It was the same as highway robbery. You see in these movies how the stagecoach is going someplace and all of a sudden the bandits come out of the woods and they take everything that the people have and then they let the people go on its way, having robbed the stagecoach. Well, piracy is kind of the same thing, only in this case, Jean Lafitte or Pierre Laffitte's vessels, which were lightly armed, would go out and they'd see a merchant ship and they would board it. The merchant ships were not armed. They were not going to fight. They generally submitted or they tried to run away if they could. Usually they couldn't. So Jean and Pierre Lafitte or whoever, were their accomplices would seize the ship, take all the cargo and take all the slaves and bring it to Barataria and all the people on the ship. And then what they're supposed to do is notify a friendly court. Well, let me see, I've gotten a little ahead of myself. All right, they would then ransom the ship back to the captain, back to the owner. In other words, okay, you want your ship back, pay us some more money, we'll give you your ship back. He would do that. They didn't ransom people, and they seized the cargo, so they had the cargo as their profit. In other words, it's a form of plunder. Now, what makes that different from piracy was that a privateer, you couldn't go out as a private citizen and just attack another private citizen's ship, another private owner's ship. But if your country was at war with that country. If the country that flew your flag, I mean, if the flag that was on your ship was a country that was at war with the other ship, then whether it was a warship or anything else, you could legally attack it. Well, they were constantly attacking Spanish vessels, and we weren't at war with Spain. The United States wasn't at war with Spain. So how did they do that? Well, some little place would declare itself independent of Spain. They'd say they were in revolt, and they'd declare themselves a republic, and they would start issuing what they call letters of marque. A letter of marque was a certificate that said your country was at war with this country and you had a right to attack its ships. Well, there was a little republic of Cartagena that declared itself in revolt against Spain. Nobody recognized this little Republic of Cartagena, nobody but privateers, because Cartagena made a fortune out of selling these letters of marque to these pirates who then could attack Spanish shipping. They could say, oh, but our country is at war with you. And of course, if anybody had really tried to crack down on this, if anybody had really tried to shut it all down, they could have. But the problem was that the U.S. kind of turned a blind eye to this privateering. Remember, I told you, look at the map and think about the U.S. and all of the Spanish territory that surrounds it, that they are hoping to get their hands on one way or another. They want this Spanish territory, and they want Spain to be weakened, even though they're at peace with her. So they don't really make much of an effort to interfere with this privateering, and this is why primarily they're attacking Spanish ships, and why primarily they're considered privateers and not pirates. There were a lot of people on Grand Isle and Cat Island where this operation was that you've heard about. One of them probably was Dominique You, which the name is always fascinating because who's named Y-O-U? Actually, his name was Frédéric Y-O-U-X, and he called himself Captain Dominique. He was not in the employ of the Laffites. He was a privateer. He was his own privateer. There were many other privateers besides the Laffites. They were called corsairs, and they traded with the Laffites. They would come in, and they would have, a cargo. They'd have a ship that they had brought in, and they'd trade it back and forth with the Laffites for whatever the Laffites had that they wanted, and so forth. So there were lots of corsairs who were coming back and forth on Grand Isle. There was a man named Renato Beluche, whom you may have heard about, who was one of their Confederates. And there was Edward Livingston. Edward Livingston was the brother of Robert Livingston. And it's kind of interesting because Edward Livingston was involved. He was a lawyer, and he had many connections. He was a friend of Andrew Jackson. His brother, of course, was very much engaged in Thomas Jefferson. Edward Livingston was engaged in every shady activity that you come up with in Louisiana. Edward Livingston's name is in it somewhere. And as I told you, the district attorney in New Orleans, the city attorney, was turning a pretty much blind eye to the privateering. Part of that was Edward Livingston's influence over him. Well, let's look at the privateers. Let's look at the Laffites in 1809. Pierre is 39. He's about 5'10". He's very powerfully built, stocky man. He has very slightly crossed eyes. He spoke English with a very heavy accent. Around 1807, as young as he was, he had a stroke that may have left him blind in one eye, but his gait was a little strange after that. He never could manage money. He was always in debt. He always spent more than he had. He declared bankruptcy a number of times. But he was the person, the land person, who took care of things at Barataria Bay in New Orleans, while his brother Jean would take care of things on the ships and in the ports and was traveling. Jean was 24 in 1809, as you can see, a lot younger. He was 6'2", very pale skin, very piercing eyes, a very stylish dresser. Now, we have this picture of him as being dashing and jovial and witty and all this stuff. That's all baloney. He basically kept discipline on Barataria, and keeping discipline with a whole bunch of these criminals was not easy. They were people who had their own operations. Many of them were their own privateers, and they could have overwhelmed Laffite at any time if it were not for Jean's very strong personality. They spread their operation to Cat Island. Jean had no sense of humor. He was very solemn and very severe. And basically, it was the force of his personality more than anything else that held this whole operation together, and the force of Pierre's business sense, even though in his private finances he wasn't too good. Both of the brothers were habitual liars, particularly Jean. They lied whenever they needed to acquire what they needed to do. And also they were professional victims, always self-aggrandizing. Oh, we are treated like pirates, and yet we do things so lawfully. We have saved this country. We have done so much good for our country in the U.S. There were all this kind of stuff went on constantly. There is no picture of them that exists, so we really don't have any idea of what either of them looked like. We do know that the public was always fascinated with Jean and not Pierre. Pierre was kind of a sidekick, but actually the two of them worked together. One never made a decision before, or at least only a temporary decision, before he could consult with the other one. They were very close. They got along perfectly. They complemented each other with their skills. It was just a perfect partnership. You have heard these stories, no doubt, about how Jean and Pierre Laffite lived like kings on Grand Isle. They had all this booty. They had all the expensive wines they wanted that they had taken off of ships. They lived decently on Grand Isle, but theirs was the only permanent house. The rest of the island were just basically shacks that were put up, I mean, worse than Motel 8s, for the privateers who would come in to trade with them, for the people, and housing for the slaves that they were holding until they could get them to New Orleans to sell them. They were very temporary houses, very rude. So there's no luxury living. They did have large warehouses, as you can imagine. They had to be able to warehouse all this stuff. And pretty soon they had a fleet of 3 vessels, only 3 vessels. Remember, their business was not to go out and attack a vessel and kill everybody on it and take the vessel in. It was merely to get a merchant vessel. A merchant vessel is nothing but a store on the water. It's going someplace to sell its products. It doesn't have a lot of arms on it any more than a store that you walk into has a lot of arms. So they go out and they go up to a vessel and they are armed and they say, okay, we're seizing you. And the captain says very sensibly, all right. They treated the personnel very, very courteously, and housed them and fed them and gave them wine and stuff like that. And they achieved a reputation for being honorable in the sense that they didn't murder anybody. They never used violence. In all of the rules in Barataria that they held to, the most important one was that nobody was to use violence against anybody else. That made a big difference, really, from a lot of the other privateers and certainly the pirates. They encountered resistance and violence only probably twice in their whole career as privateers, and those 2 times had, as you'll see, consequences. Now, it became apparent about the time of 1812, 1813, just about the time of the Battle of New Orleans, that Governor Claiborne tried to get the U.S. federal authorities to authorize him to start clamping down on the privateering operations because the government was losing too much money. The thing was that most countries depended on tariffs, can you believe it, on the tariffs on imported goods as their most important source of revenue. Up until the First World War, we didn't have an income tax until 1916. Up until that time, do you know what the major source of revenue for the United States was? It was import tariffs on imported goods. So people who were eluding these import tariffs were really hurting the economy of the United States. It was getting to the point where Claiborne was being so threatening to the privateers that Jean-Pierre were bringing their goods into New Orleans at night and distributing them to the stores. And after Claiborne started clamping down on them, they couldn't be seen on the streets. They were afraid of being arrested. Claiborne, as this is a famous incident, he announced a reward of $500 to anybody who would deliver Jean Laffite to any sheriff in Louisiana. And Jean Laffite hired a printer to put up dozens and dozens of handbills that his friends tacked up all over the city, offering $1,000 reward to anybody who would bring Claiborne to Cat Island. But then he also issued another handbill that said it was just a joke and that under no circumstances would Governor Claiborne ever come to any harm at his hands, that he respected the United States and all this stuff. Clearly, he's feeling the pressure. He's feeling like he wants to get the United States off of his back and get Claiborne off his back. All right, then we get into the Battle of New Orleans. And as many of you have heard, because most of us are diehards of this symposium, and so you've heard this story, that the British approach Laffite. They go to Barataria and they say they want to talk to him, and they're escorted in, and they want to talk terms with him. They want him to come on their side in the coming attack on New Orleans. It so happened that at the time, Pierre Laffite was in jail in New Orleans. He was a victim of some of Claiborne's tightening up. The British approached Jean. By this time, Britain and Spain are allies against the United States. They send Captain Nicholas Lockyer, who's the commander of a warship, to talk to Jean, give him a packet with 4 documents in it. In that packet is contained a letter to Laffite offering him the rank of captain in the British Army and generous grants for his men that were going to be taken out of His Majesty's colonial possessions, because they expect they're going to take back New Orleans, they're going to take back the Louisiana Territory, and it's going to be, as Ron was explaining, again, a colony of Britain. They're going to undo the American Revolution, and they're going to give all this land to Jean Laffite's men. And what he wants in return is that Jean will stop preying on the British vessels. He'll get out of Grand Isle. He'll shut down the whole operation on Grand Isle. And the British will take over Grand Isle. Now, what do they really want with the compound of Grand Isle? Yeah, there's a lot of stores there and stuff. There's materials there. But the British Navy is still wealthy. And they want to destroy it. Why? They want to use it, first of all, as a center of operations against the attack on New Orleans. This is an important thing. And they also want to be able to clear it out of any privateers who are enemies of theirs, aside from the Laffites, who might settle there and harry them. what they're offering Jean Laffite, who makes it up. Laffite says, I was a patriot of the United States. I would not do anything against my country. So they've offered me this wonderful, they offered me all kinds of money. They made tremendous offers to me. And I turned them down to work for my country. Well, baloney. They weren't offering him anything, really. A pay of a captain in the Army of Britain was a fraction of what Jean Laffite could get with any boat that he looted. He was basically saying, shut down your operation. You can come to work for us at a pittance of a salary, and you can get cheap land. Well, he could buy cheap land anyway. Land was very cheap. He could buy all he wanted to if land was what he wanted. So he's not getting too much of an offer from the British. On the other hand, if he turns these documents over to the United States, he can forestall the attack that Claiborne has asked permission to make against Grand Isle. He can get all of this pressure lifted from the Baratarians. They can go on and continue their operations. He can spring Pierre from jail. He has more, actually, to gain from siding with the United States. And if the British were to win the battle, all he had to do, which was what he was planning to do anyway if Claiborne got too hot on his tail, was just move the operation somewhere else. He wasn't going to quit being a privateer and become a good British soldier, that was for sure. Well, meanwhile, Pierre escapes from jail, and with friends and probably, the connivance of some officials. And Claiborne is now in a conciliatory mood because he begins to see that Jean Laffite can be useful to him and that he does not want the British ensconced at the back door of New Orleans where they can attack New Orleans. So Jean Laffite had about 500 men on the island, certainly no match for a British warship. If the British attacked with a warship, they were gone. What they're planning to do is get out of there first in case there is an attack. But what he really decides with the Americans is he's going to stall the British as long as he possibly can and pretend to accept their terms, but not really do anything until things get a little bit more developed. Well, meantime, Claiborne had asked the United States for permission to attack Barataria. It had no fort, in spite of the fact that we've always heard that it was fortified. It had no fort. And the men who were on the island had no desire to fight anybody. They were plunderers, they were thieves, they wanted plunder, they wanted loot. They didn't want to fight anybody. So they were not going to fight off the British. They did have a large quantity of flints and some gunpowder, but they intended, if they were attacked, simply to abandon Barataria and set up elsewhere. Well, what do you know? Claiborne gets the order from the United States, from the feds, that he has to attack Barataria. Yes, go ahead and attack. And in fact, he did. And just to show you what was on the island that was worth attacking, the Americans seized 27 privateer vessels that were moored there on their way to someplace else. They plundered all the warehouses. They got, among many other things, 10,000 gallons of wine, quite a bit of linen, a lot of silk stockings, 769 gallons of brandy, some cash, and some miscellaneous merchandise, which included slaves. All of the leaders were indicted. That is, they could be arrested, they could be tried, they could be put in jail. Well, after this attack, these negotiations between Jean and Pierre Laffite and Governor Claiborne are still going on. And all of them now petition, and all of the Creole friends of Jean, because he's very popular among the French Creole population, they are petitioning for clemency for these Baratarians in return for them participating with the Americans against the British. And no less a high personage than President Madison decides, yes, let's offer them clemency in return for participation. Well, they have to talk to General Jackson, of course, who's responsible for defending New Orleans. Jackson is totally against it. He hates the bandits. He calls them the hellish banditti. But Jackson sees finally, when invasion is imminent, that he needs every warm body and every gun he can get, and so he accepts them when he's desperate to find men and material. And also he's persuaded by his friend Livingston, who is also the intimate friend of the pirates of Jean Laffite. Well, 400 Baratarians took part in the Battle of New Orleans. They supplied 7,500 flints, which you will hear or have already heard about how important that was for Jackson. Jackson later exaggerated the importance of these flints. My material, by the way, comes from the best biography of Jean-Pierre Laffite, which is written by William C. Davis, who has addressed the symposium previous years, and he couldn't be here this year. And so I'm kind of standing in for him. The Baratarians, though, did not fight as one unit that were effective. Okay, the artillery came from here, it came from the Baratarians, this came from the They were spread over several militias. They took part a lot in the artillery firing that was on the west bank of the river. And they did give advice to Jackson about the 7 possible water avenues that offered an approach to New Orleans. But at the battle itself, only about 50 Baratarians took part in Jackson's main line, which contained 5,000 men. So you can see there were very few of them really in what came to be, nobody knew where the actual heat of the battle was going to be, but where it landed, there were rather few of the Baratarians. Most of the Baratarians had been stationed at Fort St. Philip or Fort St. John, or they were spread here and there over these several militia. Pierre was probably on the west bank next to General Coffee. Nobody ever saw Jean Laffite at the Battle of New Orleans. That's not to say he wasn't there, and it's not to say he was a coward or anything else. Who knows what he was doing? He might have been maneuvering operations somewhere else. But he, as far as we know, was not even in the battle. After the battle, the Baratarians did some service because they cleared Grand Isle of other privateers who had come in during their absence and who could have been useful to the British if the British had decided to return. Remember that Jackson, for months, expected that the British weren't gone for good, that they were going to come back and attack again. So it was important to have Grand Isle cleared. And they were important in bringing the Creole community to Jackson's side insofar as they ever came to Jackson's side. It allowed the pardons to be lifted. The Laffites got what they wanted. They were no longer the criminals that anybody could arrest. They were now people who could swagger around New Orleans along with all the other people who had participated in the battle and be given free drinks and sing in the streets. And they were heroes and very celebrated. And this was important to them. I mean, as it would be to anybody. You don't want to hide out and be a criminal. After the battle, the Baratarians go back to living on Dumaine Street with their combined families, and they do something very interesting. Let's see if I have any time. Yeah, I have a little time. That's amazing, huh? What? Oh, gosh, for once. Usually I'm thinking, oh, you know, I'm really stretching it. Well, actually, I don't have so much more time. Y'all can relax. It's not going to be too long. They actually become spies for the people they've been attacking all their years Spain. Remember I told you that under this flag of this false Republic of Cartagena, which is supposed to be at war with Spain, they've been attacking Spanish vessels. And Spanish vessels were the preponderance of the shipping that they interfered with. Well, now they become spies that are helping Spain. And this is how it happens. All of the New World colonies, you remember that Spain started losing one after another all of her Spanish-American colonies. They all start declaring their independence, from Mexico to Venezuela to Colombia to all of them. One by one, they're losing their Spanish-American colonies, and they're desperately trying to hold on to them. And the ones that are not actually declaring their independence are planning their independence. And many people at this point are willing to become out-and-out pirates and attack Spanish shipping. Well, Laffites become spies. They know all these pirates. They know all these privateers. And so they gather information about who is planning to attack a Spanish pay ship, let's say, or who is planning a revolt. And they advise Spain of the ships, the arms that are possessed by various revolutionaries, how strong they are, the privateers who are working for the revolutionaries, and other privateers who are just preying on Spanish shipping. They were recruited by none other than Père Antoine. Those of you who know a little about New Orleans history know about Father Sedella, who was a Spanish patriot, if ever there was one. And they are recruited by him, and they're more or less his handler. Now, what kinds of information do they actually give Spain in return for payment? Every time they gave them a little information, they got money. Well, in 1819, the Laffites started publicly advertising for volunteers to go and attack Texas. Texas belongs to Spain at this point. And the idea was that when these volunteers came to them, they would turn their names over to the Spanish government. And therefore, the Spanish government would know who was planning to attack Texas. Now, how did the United States act in the face of this? They kind of turned an indifferent eye to it. They were not at war with Spain. But they really didn't mind if Spain were weakened and if it lost territory. It would give them more leverage in negotiations that they had with Spain when they tried to buy or negotiate boundaries, because they're trying to buy up the western boundaries or get the western lands as much as they can. What else did they do? Well, there are other privateers out there, and at this point, privateering becomes mixed up with not just getting Spanish booty, but after plundering and seizing all the ships and all the slaves, getting Spanish territory. It becomes mixed up with this revolutionary movement to seize Spanish territory. There was a conspiracy afloat by some privateers to seize Pensacola. This is before Andrew Jackson actually conquered it, to seize Pensacola and sell it to the United States. Well, the Laffites found this out. They gave the information to Spain, which was valuable to Spain, I'm sure. There was another conspiracy. I love this one. The Quakers in Philadelphia, those peaceniks, they hatched a plan to indict a slave rebellion simultaneously in all of the Spanish-American colonies in the New World. I mean, what a harebrained plan. How in the world could you coordinate something like that? But they asked Jean Lafitte to take a leading role in this, that not knowing, of course, that he's a Spanish spy, to take a leading role in this simultaneous revolution. Well, he turns this information over to Spain, and they frustrate smugglers who are attacking Spanish ships. Well, pretty soon it's an open secret that they are spies to Spain, and they become less and less valuable to Spain because nobody's willing to share their information with them. nobody wants them in Barataria, not the U.S. government, where they're evading the tariff, and not the Spanish, where they're of less and less use to them. And by this time, the American government is leaning heavily on Barataria, and they're eventually going to shut it down. The Laffites move on to Galveston, Texas. They seized it, by the way, from another privateer outfit. When they arrive in Galveston, it's a desert with 3 or 4 huts, but within a year, it's a much bigger operation even than Barataria was. Merchandise comes in. They mask it to hide its origin. They obliterate the signs on it that tells where it came from. They transport it back to Barataria for warehousing, and then they take it by mule. They take it to spots on the Mississippi River, and from there they take it by mule into New Orleans. And they're still selling slaves. They sell them at $1 a pound, and it's still their biggest money-making operation. Now, Galveston, nobody hears much about Galveston. When you read about the Laffites, you hear about the Battle of New Orleans, and then they kind of fade. Somebody says, well, they moved to Galveston. You don't hear much about it. But Galveston is kind of interesting. It developed into a civil military community that's conducted by and for the privateers, who voluntarily support it with the prizes, that is, the captured ships, that they bring in. It has no lawful connection with any government. It is basically run by Jean Lafitte, and they're a law unto themselves. And for a while, they're completely left alone, this little enclave that operates without any law or any government or any attention to the laws and governments of either the U.S. or Mexico or Spain or any of the people who claim to own Galveston. The one rule that is observed, they have rules, but they're rules made up by Jean Lafitte. The one rule they observe is there's not to be any violence against people on the ships that they capture or anybody else. About 50 men live there permanently, and of course hundreds go in and out on these privateer ships. Jean lived in a very plain, unpainted house. He's not living in amazing luxury. It's interesting that after leaving their families in New Orleans, Pierre is, I don't know, we don't hear too much about Pierre, but within 2 or 3 weeks, Jean has 2 women living with him. So he's abandoned the family that he had in New Orleans. The problem is that around 1820, the U.S. really begins to crack down on piracy of all kinds. The New World, the new government, is getting more organized, more settled. It can give more attention to peripheral problems such as piracy, in addition to setting up banks, setting up things that they have to set up for a new government. And the same is true of the world at large. The era of piracy and privateering is coming to an end. There are fewer places really for them to go. They never intend to shut down. They plan to just move from place to place and continue their operations and take many of the same people with them. But they left Louisiana and Texas for good in 1820, and they left their families behind, and including, as I said, about 9 children, one of whom, maybe he was the 10th one, I'm not sure, one of whom is the unborn child of Pierre Lafitte. He didn't know it, but his companion was pregnant, and she will deliver a child whom he never even knew about and certainly never saw. So they leave Texas and they go for a short time to Charleston, South Carolina, and they think they're going to set up an operation that will collaborate with Colombia. But Simón Bolívar chases them out of Colombia. So then they think they'll settle a base in Cancun. But they're run out of Cancun as well. Pierre died in a remote Cancun village of a fever that he contracted while he's trying to set up these operations. Nobody's sure, by the way, where he's buried. Jean was wounded in one of the few instances where a ship actually fought back when it was seized. And this one was off the coast of Jamaica. And before he had fully recovered from this serious wound, he unwittingly attacked what turned out to be a Spanish warship. He thought it was a merchant ship and, that there would be no fighting, and the Spanish warship just blew him out of the water. He was fatally wounded, and he died in February 1823, a few months after his brother. He was only 40 years old, and his brother, who was 12 years older, you can figure, was 52. And he had to be buried at sea. They couldn't preserve the body until they could get it to land to bury it. So the era of pirates basically is over, and the era of legends and rumors about them starts and continues to this day. Almost everything that you read about the pirates Laffite is balderdash. The most colorful legend about Jean is that he had actually rescued Napoleon from St. Helena, and the two of them lived and died in Louisiana, happy companions. And moreover, the two of them were cousins, and Jean's uncle, John Paul Jones, you remember the naval hero, that he was buried with them. I mean, it gets more and more complicated. What happened to their Confederates, Dominique You, who had never learned to read or write or even sign his name, gave up privateering. He lived in the Faubourg Marigny for many years in a very modest house. He became something of a neighborhood character. He was destitute when he died, and he had to be buried in a pauper's grave. Renato Beluche prospered to some extent. He stayed in New Orleans. He owned several properties. He left the city, though, to go off. It's a kind of strange thing for a middle-aged man to do. This is a young person's exploit. He wanted to go off and fight with Bolivar for Spanish-American independence. He went off, and he was never heard from again. The state granted his wife a divorce on grounds of abandonment, and the divorce came through a couple of months after she died. Well, the help that the Laffites gave in the Battle of New Orleans certainly was not crucial. The damage that they did to Spain with their depredations of Spanish shipping certainly didn't impede Spanish shipping very much. It was an annoyance, but it didn't really hurt Spain. They were rumored to be more upright than other privateers and pirates, and indeed they were. They weren't murderous. They didn't murder anybody in cold blood. They had a set of ethics of their own, and when you consider that they're operating in a thicket of thieves and brutal guys, brutal characters, they managed to hold together an operation that was somewhat predictable and somewhat sane. They were part of the folk history of America. I think if they had any influence, it was lasting. It was that. When you think about the early 1800s and you think about our folk heroes in American history, all of them were guys who did daring exploits, who were all on the fringes of civilization, and who were very little inhibited by law. Why? Because laws were fluid, few, and irregular in the New World in their time. As the country became more and more settled and each area became more and more organized and more under the rule of law, these kinds of heroes were less and less feasible. But they are part of the folk hero of the history. As for their descendants, their longtime mistresses, Catherine and Marie Villard, all of them, Marie Villard married, or was it Catherine? I'm not sure, one of them, Catherine. Catherine remarried, and their children, these many children of Jean-Pierre, all married mulattoes, people of mixed blood. And they were already mulattoes or quadroons. They were already mostly white people, and they keep marrying people who are also light-skinned, not whites necessarily, but as the generations go, they get whiter and whiter, so that after a couple of generations, they basically passed into the white world, so that there are now many biracial people who claim to be descendants of the Laffites, and many white people who do, white people who generations and generations back had a 16th part blood of black blood. So that's the story of Laffites. You've been a wonderful, attentive audience, and again, I'm so grateful to be here for this wonderful free symposium that Curtis Manning does. I know he has a lot of help from a lot of people, but it's basically a one-man operation that he does, and I'm so glad to be a part of it. Thank you.
And out of appreciation, I want to present this, one of the titles of the Louisiana Institute of Higher Education, the Battle of New Orleans Reconsidered, to Christina Vella with great appreciation for that. Thank you. All right.